This means an avoidant wants you forever and loves deeply, not temporarily, not when it's convenient, not only during the highs, forever. And the strange part is, most people completely miss the signs when it's happening, because when an avoidant truly falls in love, it rarely looks dramatic in the beginning. There are no loud declarations, no overwhelming obsession, no constant emotional performances designed to convince you they care. In fact, what makes it confusing is that the deeper their feelings become, the quieter they often get. And if you've ever sat there staring at your phone wondering why someone who clearly feels connected suddenly becomes distant, calm, hard to read, or emotionally difficult to reach, this video is going to hit somewhere very deep inside you, because avoidants are not emotionless people. They are emotionally guarded people. There's a massive difference. Most of them learned very early in life that depending on others felt dangerous, disappointing, overwhelming, or unsafe. So instead of expressing attachment openly, they learn to survive by controlling it, hiding it, shrinking it, pretending they need less than they actually do. But here's what nobody talks about. When an avoidant finally finds someone who feels emotionally safe, something begins changing underneath the surface. Slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. Their defenses don't collapse overnight, but little cracks start forming in the armor they spent years building. And if you stay until the end of this video, you'll understand the hidden signs that reveal when an avoidant isn't just attached to you, but when they secretly see you as permanent. And if this kind of deep psychological insight speaks your language, subscribe now, because this channel is for the people who feel everything intensely but rarely hear anyone explain it properly. The biggest misunderstanding about avoidance is the belief that they cannot love deeply. People assume distance means disinterest, silence means detachment, emotional hesitation means lack of care. But many avoidants feel emotions so intensely that closeness itself becomes terrifying. That's the part people fail to understand. They don't always run because they feel nothing. Sometimes they run because they feel too much. Real intimacy threatens the emotional control they've depended on for survival. The closer someone gets, the more exposed they feel. An exposure to an avoidant nervous system can feel almost unbearable. So while other people move toward love instinctively, avoidants often move toward it while simultaneously resisting it. Imagine craving connection while also fearing what connection can do to you. Imagine wanting someone deeply but feeling your nervous system panic every time they get emotionally close enough to matter. That internal conflict shapes almost everything they do in relationships. It's why they may seem warm one moment and distant the next, why they can look completely calm while internally spiraling, why they sometimes disappear after emotional intimacy instead of leaning further into it. They are not simply avoiding you. Often they are trying to manage the fear that loving someone gives that person the power to hurt them. And once you understand this, you begin seeing their behavior differently, because an avoidant who truly wants you forever will not necessarily become more emotionally loud. They become more emotionally vulnerable in subtle ways that most people overlook. There is also a huge difference between attention and emotional permanence. Avoidants can enjoy people without attaching deeply. They can flirt, connect, spend time together, even care about someone, yet still remain emotionally detached enough to leave when things become too intense. But when an avoidant genuinely loves someone at a soul-deep level, something shifts psychologically. Even when they pull away physically, they stay emotionally connected underneath. You remain present in their mind during silence, during distance, during moments when they appear emotionally unavailable. And this is why people become confused by avoidance, because sometimes the avoidant who says the least feels the most. They may not constantly chase reassurance or flood you with emotional words, but your presence starts shaping their inner world in ways they cannot easily control. They think about your reactions before making decisions. They replay conversations privately. They remember small emotional details you forgot mentioning. They carry your emotional energy long after interactions end. And the strange thing is, many avoidants don't even realize how attached they've become until separation happens, until the silence feels heavier than expected. Until distraction stops working, until they notice that no matter how much distance they create, their mind keeps returning to the same person. That is when the emotional permanence begins revealing itself, because casual interest fades during distance. Deep attachment survives it. One of the clearest signs an avoidant wants you forever is when they begin letting you into parts of themselves they normally protect from everyone. Avoidants are intensely private emotionally, not just secretive, but protective. Their inner world is usually guarded behind layers of self-control, independence, humor, distraction, or emotional neutrality. Most people only meet the surface version of them. But when an avoidant starts sharing personal fears, old wounds, embarrassing memories, private thoughts, family pain, insecurities, or emotional experiences they usually hide, something enormous is happening psychologically. They are risking visibility. And for an avoidant, visibility feels dangerous, because once someone truly sees you, rejection cuts deeper. Betrayal hurts more. Loss becomes more terrifying. That's why these moments matter so much. Maybe they suddenly open up late at night in an unexpected conversation. Maybe they admit something vulnerable and immediately try to laugh it off afterward. Maybe they reveal a fear they've never said aloud before. These moments may seem small to someone else, but internally, they are massive acts of trust. And the deeper their feelings become, the more their hidden self slowly emerges around you. Not all at once, not dramatically, but piece by piece, the real version of them starts slipping through the cracks, and eventually something even more powerful begins happening. They stop performing. Avoidants spend much of their lives managing perception, looking unaffected, looking independent, looking emotionally self-contained. They often feel safer when nobody knows how deeply things impact them. So they become skilled at emotional editing. They downplay attachment, suppress vulnerability, act less affected than they truly are. But when an avoidant truly sees someone as permanent, maintaining that performance becomes exhausting. Slowly they start relaxing into authenticity around you. Their imperfections become visible. Their emotional contradictions become harder to hide. They stop trying so hard to appear untouchable. And this is one of the deepest forms of intimacy an avoidant can offer. Because real love for them is not dramatic emotional intensity. It is emotional unmasking. It's when they no longer feel the constant need to manage every reaction, every feeling, every moment of vulnerability around you. They begin showing you the tired parts, the confused parts, the overwhelmed parts, the emotionally messy parts they normally keep hidden from the world. And ironically, this is usually the moment people misread them the most. Because avoidants often look less polished when they truly love someone. Less controlled, less emotionally distant, more human, more uncertain, more emotionally affected, and underneath all of it is the hidden truth they struggle to say directly: you matter enough to hurt me now. And this is why one of the most misunderstood signs of deep love from an avoidant is silence that no longer feels like escape. In the beginning, their silence often carries tension, distance, emotional uncertainty. You can almost feel them retreating inward, disappearing into themselves whenever things become emotionally intense. But when an avoidant truly wants someone forever, their silence slowly changes shape. It becomes softer, safer, less defensive. They stop feeling the need to constantly protect themselves from your presence, and suddenly there are moments where they can simply exist beside you without performing emotional management every second. No pressure to impress, no urgency to flee, no need to control every interaction. Just quiet presence. And to most people that may not sound romantic. But for an avoidant, peaceful emotional stillness with another person is incredibly intimate, because their nervous system is finally learning that closeness does not automatically equal danger. They can sit beside you without mentally preparing an exit. They can share space without feeling emotionally trapped. They can be quiet without emotionally disconnecting. And if you pay attention closely, you begin noticing the difference between silence that creates distance and silence that creates comfort. One feels cold, the other feels like emotional rest. That is when the relationship begins moving beyond attraction and into something far deeper. Because avoidants rarely stay emotionally relaxed around people they do not trust deeply. Their calmness around you becomes the confession they cannot easily say aloud. But even when they begin feeling safe, another complicated pattern often appears. Avoidants unconsciously test love, not always intentionally, not always manipulatively. Sometimes they are simply trying to answer a terrifying internal question they cannot silence: what happens if I truly need someone? And because that question scares them, they may create distance to observe your reaction. They may become confusing after moments of closeness. They may suddenly need space after emotional intimacy. Sometimes they pull away emotionally right when the connection starts feeling strongest. To someone on the receiving end, this can feel painful and contradictory, but internally the avoidant is often watching carefully. Watching whether love becomes controlling, watching whether emotional closeness turns into pressure, watching whether conflict leads to abandonment, watching whether your care remains steady when they are not emotionally easy. And the tragic part is that many avoidants do not even fully understand they are testing safety while it's happening. Their nervous system simply reacts automatically based on old emotional conditioning. If love once felt unstable, overwhelming, or unsafe, then part of them expects the same outcome again, so they brace themselves before the pain arrives. They create emotional exits before attachment becomes complete. But when an avoidant keeps returning emotionally despite these fears, despite their own internal resistance, despite the discomfort vulnerability creates inside them, it often means the bond matters far more deeply than they are capable of expressing directly. Because avoidants do not repeatedly fight themselves internally for connections that mean nothing to them. And then one day, almost without noticing it, you begin appearing inside their future. Not in dramatic speeches, not necessarily through grand romantic declarations, but quietly, naturally, automatically. They start speaking as if your existence in their life is assumed. They mention future plans and unconsciously include you in them. They reference future routines, future experiences, future responsibilities, future places they want to go with you. And what makes this so significant is that avoidants are usually extremely careful with emotional permanence. They protect their independence fiercely because independence has always felt emotionally safer than reliance. So when they begin mentally building a future that includes another person, it means something inside them is slowly shifting from self-protection toward emotional partnership. Maybe they casually mention something months away and instinctively assume you'll be there. Maybe they start considering your needs while making life decisions. Maybe they create space for you inside routines they once guarded completely for themselves. These are not small things for an avoidant. These are psychological indicators of attachment deepening beyond temporary emotion, because avoidants do not naturally orient their lives around permanence with people unless the emotional connection has reached somewhere profound inside them. They may still fear vulnerability. They may still struggle with closeness, but subconsciously they are beginning to build emotional continuity with you, and that continuity is one of the clearest signs that what they feel is no longer casual. Another moment that reveals extraordinary emotional depth is when an avoidant stops running from conflict. This does not mean they suddenly become perfect communicators overnight. It does not mean they stop shutting down completely, but something changes in the way they handle emotional discomfort. Before deep attachment, conflict often feels unbearable to avoidants because it threatens emotional overwhelm, criticism, shame, or loss of autonomy. Their instinct is usually escape, withdraw, disappear, shut down, end the conversation before vulnerability deepens further. But when an avoidant truly loves someone, they slowly begin fighting against this instinct, and that battle is far more emotionally difficult for them than most people realize. Staying emotionally present during hard conversations can feel almost physically uncomfortable for someone whose nervous system learned survival through emotional distance. Yet they try anyway, maybe imperfectly, maybe inconsistently, but they try. They come back after withdrawing instead of disappearing forever. They revisit difficult conversations they normally would avoid completely. They make awkward attempts at emotional honesty even when it clearly terrifies them. And sometimes, the most loving thing an avoidant ever does is remain emotionally present while every instinct inside them is screaming to leave. That is the part many people never see, the internal war happening beneath the surface. Because when avoidants do not care deeply, leaving feels easy. Emotional detachment protects them, but when someone matters profoundly, walking away no longer creates relief. It creates emotional loss. And eventually they begin realizing that avoiding conflict also means risking the connection itself. So for the first time they attempt something their nervous system has resisted for years, staying. And underneath all of this is a hidden exhaustion most avoidants rarely talk about openly. The exhaustion of pretending not to care as much as they actually do. The exhaustion of emotional suppression, of appearing unaffected while internally carrying enormous emotional weight. Avoidants often spend years convincing themselves that needing people is weakness, that emotional dependence is dangerous, that vulnerability leads to pain. But deep love slowly destabilizes those beliefs, because eventually someone reaches parts of them they can no longer emotionally disconnect from. And maintaining emotional distance starts feeling less safe than honesty. This is when unexpected moments begin happening. Small cracks in the emotional armor. Sudden confessions that seem to surprise even them. Vulnerable statements spoken quietly and quickly before they retreat again. Emotional honesty appearing in flashes instead of long speeches. You may notice them staring at you differently during quiet moments, lingering emotionally instead of withdrawing immediately, becoming softer after periods of distance. And beneath all of it is a person who is growing tired of carrying love silently, a person beginning to realize that their feelings are too real to keep minimizing forever. Because the deeper an avoidant falls in love, the harder it becomes to maintain the illusion of emotional indifference. Eventually, the truth leaks through the silence. And when that truth finally begins leaking through, it rarely arrives in dramatic ways. Avoidants usually do not wake up one morning suddenly transformed into emotionally expressive people who pour out every feeling openly. Their love often reveals itself through loyalty long before vulnerability becomes verbal. And this is where many people misunderstand them completely, because society teaches people to recognize love through constant reassurance, emotional intensity, or obvious romantic behavior. But avoidants often express attachment through consistency that quietly survives over time. They remember details they never mention out loud. They notice changes in your energy before you say anything. They check on you in practical ways instead of emotional speeches. They show up during difficult moments even when emotional situations make them uncomfortable. And perhaps most importantly, they remain psychologically connected to the people they truly love even when their behavior appears restrained on the surface. Their loyalty is often internal before it becomes external. They may not always communicate perfectly, but emotionally they keep returning to the same person in their mind, the same voice, the same presence, the same emotional home. And if an avoidant keeps choosing you quietly over time despite all their fears around closeness, despite their instinct to remain emotionally independent, despite how vulnerable attachment makes them feel internally, then what you are witnessing is not shallow interest. It is emotional commitment developing in the only way their nervous system knows how. Slowly, carefully, deeply. And eventually something happens that avoidants struggle enormously to control. They begin missing you in ways that disrupt their emotional independence. This is one of the most psychologically revealing stages of avoidant attachment because avoidants are deeply conditioned to suppress emotional dependency. They often pride themselves on self-sufficiency, on needing nobody, on remaining emotionally self-contained. But real love slowly dismantles that illusion. At first they may deny it completely. They distract themselves, stay busy, rationalize their feelings, pretend the connection is manageable. But then your absence begins changing their emotional atmosphere in ways they cannot ignore. Silence feels heavier. Ordinary moments feel strangely empty. Their mind starts returning to you automatically during random parts of the day. They hear something and instinctively think of telling you. They experience stress and unexpectedly crave your presence. And this realization can genuinely scare them. Because once an avoidant realizes someone has become emotionally significant enough to affect their inner stability, fear often intensifies alongside love. Suddenly there is something to lose, something powerful enough to hurt them if it disappears. And this creates one of the deepest contradictions inside avoidance. The more irreplaceable someone becomes, the more emotionally vulnerable they feel, which is why they sometimes pull away right when attachment deepens most intensely. Not because the feelings disappeared, but because the feelings became too real to comfortably contain anymore. What makes this even more complicated is that avoidants rarely ask for reassurance directly. In fact, many of them feel deeply uncomfortable admitting emotional needs at all. They learned long ago that vulnerability could lead to disappointment, rejection, or emotional dependence they could not control. So instead of openly saying, "I need reassurance," they communicate those needs indirectly in ways people often miss entirely. Sometimes they ask subtle questions designed to measure emotional safety. Sometimes they watch your reactions closely during vulnerable moments. Sometimes they become unusually quiet because they are internally waiting to see whether you notice the emotional shift. And other times they create small emotional openings and silently hope you respond gently instead of critically. An avoidant may never openly say, "Please prove you won't hurt me," but underneath many of their behaviors that fear exists constantly. They want reassurance without feeling emotionally exposed for needing it. They want consistency without feeling controlled by attachment. They want emotional safety while simultaneously fearing what happens if they trust it fully. And when someone responds to those hidden fears with steadiness instead of emotional chaos, something profound begins happening internally. The avoidant nervous system slowly stops expecting abandonment around every emotional corner. Trust begins replacing hypervigilance little by little, not instantly, not perfectly, but enough for deeper attachment to grow roots. And perhaps nowhere is this internal struggle more visible than in the emotional contradictions avoidants display when they truly love someone. This is the stage that confuses people the most because the avoidant can appear deeply attached and emotionally conflicted at the exact same time. One moment they seem emotionally open, soft, connected, present. The next moment they become distant, overwhelmed, uncertain, or hard to read again. And what many people interpret as inconsistency is often the visible collision between two powerful emotional forces happening simultaneously inside them: the desire for closeness and the fear of what closeness can do to them. Part of them wants intimacy desperately, another part fears surrendering emotional control, part of them craves permanence, another part fears dependence. So they move forward emotionally, then panic internally once vulnerability increases. They soften, then instinctively retreat to regain emotional balance. And if you truly understand avoidance, you begin realizing something heartbreaking beneath this contradiction. The very behaviors that look emotionally confusing are often evidence that the attachment has become emotionally significant. Because avoidants do not experience this level of internal conflict over people they feel indifferent toward. Indifference is easy for them. Deep attachment is what destabilizes them. Deep attachment is what creates emotional turbulence. Deep attachment is what forces them into uncomfortable psychological territory where they can no longer fully protect themselves from needing another human being. And despite all this complexity, avoidants often communicate love in the smallest, quietest ways imaginable. Not through dramatic romance, not always through endless emotional conversations, but through subtle acts that reveal emotional devotion underneath restraint. They remember what matters to you without being reminded. They quietly adjust their behavior to make your life easier. They show up during painful moments even if emotional intensity overwhelms them internally. They pay attention to tiny details because your emotional world becomes important to them privately. And these practical expressions of care often carry more meaning than grand declarations because they emerge from genuine emotional investment rather than temporary emotion. An avoidant who deeply loves someone may struggle to say the perfect words, but they will often reveal love through consistency of presence, through effort, through reliability, through choosing you repeatedly in quiet ways nobody else notices. And perhaps the most meaningful part is this: avoidants rarely invest sustained emotional energy into people they do not truly value. Their emotional resources are protected carefully. So when they continuously pour time, attention, thought, patience, and quiet loyalty into someone over long periods of time, it is